The Resource Management Act of 1991, or the RMA, is New Zealand's national environmental policy. While New Zealand has always had laws that protect the environment, in 1991 the RMA consolidated many of these laws to become a single integrated policy framework. The RMA attempts to protect our environment and natural resources from activities that may disturb or impact others' enjoyment of these resources. Activities considered in the RMA include such things as building a house, removing native vegetation, moving earth, taking water from a stream, setting up a business, or burning rubbish, which can all affect our neighbors, our wider community, or the land, water, and air on which we all depend for our survival. The RMA gives everyone rights and responsibilities about protecting the environment and people's enjoyment of it. It requires you to think about the environmental effects of the things you want to do and make sure negative environmental effects are lessened and avoided wherever possible. The RMA includes systems and processes for making decisions about things that could affect other people's enjoyment of their environment or the wider environment. It aims to make sure that natural and physical resources such as soil, air, water, and buildings are managed sustainably. Sustainable management means that the effects of our activities don't damage the environment beyond repair or use too many resources that can't be replaced for us by future generations. The RMA can't avoid conflicts over the use of resources or the environmental effects of people's activities, but it can provide an open and fair forum where differing positions can be discussed and solutions can be found. The RMA is only concerned with the effects of our actions on the environment and not with the wider effects on society or the economy. If you wanted to open, for example, a new fish or chip shop, the RMA would be concerned with the smell of greasy food or whether it might annoy the people living next door, rather than its effects on a pizzeria across the road or adding to someone's cholesterol levels. Like any long-standing policy document, the RMA has become more and more complicated over time, and to some degree it has lost its way in protecting our environment to the extent that it was first imagined to do. Critics argue that it has become overly complicated and time-consuming to get the critical consent needed to build things like adequate supplies of housing. Let's take a quick detour and hear about why an effort has been made to replace the RMA with a more modern policy framework and what that new policy framework might look like.
David Parker says the 30-year-old Resource Management Act is failing in one of its main objectives, protection of the environment. And changes are needed to make it easier to build houses as well. I spoke to him a short time ago and he says balancing environmental and development demands can be done.
We want to make sure that environmental bottom lines are protected, and they haven't been. Water quality's got worse, climate change emissions have gone up, we continue to lose wetlands, so it really hasn't worked as it was intended to protect the environment. And then conversely, we've got a housing crisis, and although the RMA is not the only cause of that, it is true that some of the planning constraints and just delays in the planning system have contributed.
Well, that suggests to me that you need to split the Act in half, don't you? Go back to a town and country format where you have your city planning rules for the housing and then the environmental ones for outside the city. Is that a possibility?
Quick reminder here. We talked about the Town and Country Act and the concepts around it in Lecture 3, Part 4, Concepts from the UK.
Yeah, that's one of the ideas that will be considered. We'll wait for advice on that. You could do that in the same Act, of course, have different rules for urban areas and different procedures for urban development compared with, protecting some of these common resources like water and soil.
Of course, farmers like to argue that water quality in the cities, for example, is pretty bad as well as in the regions.
Yeah, and that's a fair criticism. We do actually have to be fair and address both. But there's a couple of things I'd say about that. Only about 1% of waterways are in cities, but some of them are amongst the most degraded in the country. Auckland is a case in point, but in fairness to them, they're bringing forward $900 million of expenditure to better separate sewage from stormwater to stop those sewage overflows.
Let's look at some examples. So under a new act, would there be less dairy farm conversions because of the impact of those conversions on waterways?
If it had been in place historically, yeah, I think I would hope so, because that has been a major contributor to the degradation of water quality.
So just to be clear there, so a changed law could mean that it would be potentially harder to convert land to dairy farming.
Well, in areas where we've already got polluted waterways from nitrate levels caused by dairy farming, if you put another dairy farm in the catchment without reducing other nitrate losses and pollution to waterways from other dairy farms, you're going to make it worse. So even the existing RMA should be of that effect.
But it hasn't been, has it, clearly?
No, which is one of the reasons why outside of this process we're sort of proceeding ahead of this wider RMA reform with changes for the Essential Freshwater Program.
Okay, let's flip it back the other way, and for the home building, how much quicker and easier could it be to build affordable housing, the large-scale housing that this country needs under some proposed changes? What is the goal here? What's success look like?
Well, again, because that problem is so urgent, we've got people sleeping on the streets and in vans in Auckland at a shameful rate. We've already got separate work outside of this to create a carve-out from the RMA for some of these large developments like Unitec through this Housing and Urban Development Authority. Now, we've got separate legislation coming to do that, but it's more ad hocery. We've done it for originally the Environment Canterbury, then for the Christchurch earthquakes, for the plan amalgamation.
Urban Development Authorities essentially under this new changes everywhere?
Councils have said, look, you're right. It takes far too long to change a plan. It takes longer than the 3-year term of a local government at the moment, and it's their laws that they're meant to be in control of. And so when we came out with our proposals for an urban development authority, which are in the process of being legislated, they said we need these more broadly. So that's one of the things we will consider.
But at essence, what we're talking about here is removing the responsibility for the consenting planning issues from local councils to a sort of more central or separate organisation. So you're taking responsibility away from councils, and is that a principle you want to see furthered? That it's no longer the councils can't do it. They struggle. They cope. They don't have the resources.
Not necessarily. I mean, the Urban Development Authority does sometimes take it away from councils and has it done by central government. But what councils are saying is that they need fast plan-making processes themselves that are quicker and less costly, because it costs too much and it takes too long, and we haven't achieved the environmental outcomes we want and all the housing we need.
You've got national policy statements up your sleeve where the government can make directions so you can get some development moving, which is what a lot of people want. Why not use them more?
Well, that's a fair criticism. They should have been used straight after the RMA came into effect back in the early 1990s.
Will you use them more?
We already are. We've got one coming on, a revised one on fresh water, an updated one on urban development, one to protect elite soils, the likes of the soils in the south of Auckland. We've got one coming on biodiversity. So yeah, we've got a lot of them coming through. But it remains true that even with those, the RMA hasn't performed as people intended, and 30 years after it came into effect, someone's got to have a crack at doing it right. This is a 796-piece gargantuan piece of complexity at the moment. You can't fix it on the back of an envelope.
That's David Parker there, the Environment Minister.
Hi, my name's David Parker. I'm the Minister for the Environment. The RMA is a really important piece of legislation. Every country needs a good cornerstone piece of legislation to both manage environmental effects but also enable development that we need for the likes of housing. And there's a pretty broad consensus in New Zealand that the RMA is past its use-by date, takes too long, costs too much, and it really hasn't adequately protected the environment if you look at what our outcomes have been for freshwater and climate change, for example. Now, not all of those problems are caused by the RMA, but the RMA and some of its imperfections are part of the problem. And so we're proposing to replace it with 3 pieces of legislation. Firstly, the Natural and Built Environments Act. That will have an environmental test which protects biophysical values for future generations, but also will help facilitate development of housing so that we have affordable housing. The second piece of legislation is a Strategic Planning Act. That sits across the new Natural and Built Environments Act, what we call the NBA, above the Local Government Act, the Climate Change Response Act, and the Land Transport Management Act. And that'll enable long-term strategic decisions to be made so that we get ahead in a bit of our infrastructure planning. We reserve the areas that shouldn't be subject to development pressure, but we can buy infrastructure sites like areas that we need for hospitals and roads in the future. The third piece of legislation is the Managed Retreat and Climate Change Adaptation Act, and that will help us deal with some of these issues that are coming at us in the coming decades as a consequence of climate change. We're trying to finish off these three parts within this parliamentary term. We promised at the election we'd done that. We've got the advantage of a lot of prior work by the Productivity Commission, a group of which was included Environmental Defence Society, the Northern EMA, property investors, and also Infrastructure New Zealand. We've had Waitangi Tribunal reports, we've had input from local government. It's time to get on with it, see this through to conclusion, which we hope to do, or we intend to do within this 3-year period of this government. Last thing I'll say is that the NBA part of it is kicked off by an exposure draft which is going to go to an inquiry through a select committee to which the public will be able to submit. That draws on the work of the Randerson panel, which was very detailed, and it'll include the main equivalent of Part 2 of the RMA plus some other essential sections, and we'll have a good look in those at detail while we do the drafting for the rest of the Act, which is important, but a lot of that's more administrative. The core Part 2 replacement will have an initial round of consultation through that Select Committee inquiry, and then later in the year the Strategic Planning Act and the full Natural and Built Environments Act will go through another Select Committee process. We've got good engagement with local government, we've got separate engagement with iwi. Their interests in the RMA are well known and well reported on by the Waitangi Tribunal. So there's a lot of work ahead for everyone. We really encourage members of the public to engage.
Despite the impending transformation of the RMA, there are elements of the policy that will have a lasting impact on our built environment, our planning process, and likely continue in some form into the new policies. One of these elements is called a designation. The RMA allows for areas of land to be designated for use as network utilities, such as roads and telecommunication facilities, or large public works such as schools and prisons. These designated areas, or designations, are identified in district plans, usually within the document's maps. Once a designation is in the plan, the proposed works can be carried out there at any time. The authority responsible does not have to comply with district plan rules. Here, we can see factors related to designations in the RMA. By definition, a designation is a planning technique used by ministers of the Crown, local authorities, and network utility operators approved as requiring authorities under Section 167 of the RMA. Only requiring authorities can seek designations for land. Historically, designations have enabled central and local government to get planning authorization for public works and protected land for future public works. Requiring authorities can only make a designation where they are financially responsible for the project, work, or operation on the designated land. Under the RMA, land can be designated for public works or network utilities only by the requiring authority. These can be a minister of the Crown, a local authority, a network utility operator approved under the RMA. The requiring authority has to have financial responsibility for a project, work, or operation on the designated land. Ministers of the Crown and local authorities are automatically requiring authorities. Network utility operators, organizations that distribute gas, petroleum, geothermal energy, telecommunications, electricity, water, wastewater, or which construct or operate roads, railway lines, and airports have to apply for acquiring authority status from the Minister of the Environment. There are a variety of functions that can be served by designated land. But before we get into that, let's take a look at the two types of plans that are developed at the local level. Regional plans are created by regional councils to manage water, air, soil, the coast, and discharges.
The Minister of Conservation is tasked with preparing a coastal plan for the Kermadec and Subantarctic Islands. These places are a hotspot internationally for biodiversity. They contain rare ecosystems, rare species, which are prone to high levels of risk. The risks are associated around pest incursions both in the marine environment and the land-based environment, which often come about through visitation from fishing vessels and cruise ships, for example. The unique nature of this plan was using vessel length as a proxy for managing risk. Surface water activities are not often controlled through coastal plans, and this was the main mechanism we had for managing potential threat to that unique biodiversity. The other matter that we had to focus on was the use or carriage of heavy fuel oil. That is the first time that we are aware that anyone has attempted to manage that through a coastal plan process. Another challenge was that most of the users of this place are not located there. Its remote nature results in no one really living on these islands. All of the interested parties were scattered around the world. We had to find a way to bring these people together to manage that conversation. The last challenge was around managing hull cleanliness. One of the biggest threats is around bringing in marine pest species through unclean boats. The plan has now been operative since September 2017, and we have placed a great focus on compliance with these provisions, which in itself is challenging. It has been pleasing to see that the content around compliance is working. We've had our first successful prosecution on non-compliance around vessel length.
District plans are created by city or district councils to manage the use and subdivision of land.
Whangarei's population is growing significantly, and as our population continues to grow, strategic development is crucial to retain and build on our city centre's unique identity. The city core lacked a strategic vision, including realistic outcomes to address some of its biggest challenges. To respond to the challenges, the project team developed innovative planning and design-led solutions. We included a collaborative process that allowed council staff and elected members to directly inform the direction and content of the city core precinct plan. Their ideas and trust was the key to success. To provide a framework to drive change within the city core, 6 key urban design concepts were developed. Reinforcing easy navigation, nurturing the city core character, supporting diversity in a mix of housing and land uses, encouraging vibrancy and activity, ensuring safe connections, and developing quality public spaces. It also gives the business community assurance that the Council has a plan in place, giving greater certainty for investment and private development. We wanted this plan to be achievable and practical. Short-term actions have a budget for implementation, and the plan is flexible enough to trigger long-term change when needed. And actions from the plan are already being delivered. This includes improving the wayfinding, refurbishing our existing bus station, development of a new tourist bus hub, and detailed design for improving intersections and footpaths. The private sector is responding to the clarity of the vision in the plan, with new businesses opening in the city core and new developments on the horizon. Through meaningful collaboration and realistic outcomes, we have developed a clear vision for our city core for now and for the future.
It is important to know that a designation only applies to district plans. If a requiring authority wants to do something that requires a resource consent from the regional council, it must apply for a resource consent like anyone else.
A resource consent is permission to undertake an activity or to construct a building that does not comply with the district plan rules. It requires you to consider the effects of your project on the environment, the community, and your neighbours. You'll also need a resource consent for subdividing your land. A resource consent is different from a building consent, which covers how something is constructed to comply with the Building Act. The district plan is made up of activity areas shown as different colours. Each activity area has its own rules telling you what activities are permitted activities and what activities need resource consent. The district plan maps also show special requirements such as protected trees and heritage buildings. These symbols mean that additional rules apply to the property. Using the district plan inquiry, you can search your property and bring up all the relevant rules. You can also specify what activity you want to do, and the rules will be narrowed down to this activity. If your activity is permitted and meets all the relevant standards, then no resource consent is required. If your activity is a controlled, restricted discretionary, or non-complying activity, then you need to apply for a resource consent. To apply for resource consent, you will need to compile the relevant documentation. For a subdivision, you will need a surveyor to produce survey plans. Otherwise, the plans would usually be drawn by an architect or draftsperson. One of the most important things you'll need to provide is an assessment of the environmental effects, an AEE. You can ask a consultant planner, surveyor, or architect to prepare this for you. If the proposal is small in scale, you may wish to prepare this yourself. Council planners can give you guidance on this. An AEE describes the effects of your proposed activity on the surrounding environment and on your neighbours. The complexity of your assessment will depend on the scale of your proposal. Let's look at some things that would normally trigger a resource consent. Andrea wants to extend her garden area and needs to do some earthworks at the back of her property. In her assessment of the environmental effects, she details how they're going to landscape and build a retaining wall to protect the bank from slips and reduce the visual effects. John wants to construct a second story on his house. His assessment of effects will need to consider if the addition will have an unfair impact on his neighbours, such as shading and loss of privacy. Susie wants to open a childcare centre. She will need to identify and assess any potential effects such as noise and traffic. She may put up acoustic fencing and provide a traffic management plan to mitigate adverse effects of noise and traffic. If you think that your activity may have an effect on your neighbour, then you should seek their approval. Council will assess your proposal and then visit your property. They will assess the effects on your neighbours and the surrounding area. If you have provided your neighbours written approval with your application, then the planner will not need to consider if they are affected. As long as all the relevant information is supplied, Council will provide you with a decision after 20 working days. If your resource consent is granted, make sure you read and understand your conditions. The proposal must be undertaken as shown on your plans, so make sure you get it right first time, as it may be difficult to change later.
So, what can the designated land be used for? The requiring authority can use the designated land for the designation notation or designated purpose as set out in the district plan. This is also known as the scope of the designation. If the requiring authority wants to use the land for something outside that scope, normal district plan provisions apply. In other words, the requiring authority would need a resource consent unless the activity they propose is permitted in the district plan. For example, a designation might be granted for a Telecom New Zealand network utility site. In this case, the notation on the district plan might be radio communications, telecommunications, and ancillary purposes. If the telecom or any other party wanted to carry out an activity on the site that didn't come within that definition, it might need to obtain a resource consent from the district or city council. Another layer of the designation process is the notice of requirement. A notice of requirement is the way a requiring authority gives notice to a council that is seeking to designate land. Until it has been included in a district plan, a designation is referred to as a notice of requirement. There are several things set out by the RMA that need to be included in the notice of requirement. These include the site location, the nature of the proposed work, the nature of the proposed restrictions that would apply, the effects that the work will have on the environment and the ways in which any adverse effects will be mitigated, the extent to which alternative sites, routes, and methods have been considered, why the work and designation are reasonably necessary for achieving the objectives of the requiring authority, details of any resource consents that are needed and whether they have been applied for, details of any consultation that has been carried out with the parties likely to be affected. Once the Notice of Requirement has been lodged, the Council or Environmental Protection Authority, EPA, a Board of Inquiry, or the Environment Court, can ask the requiring authority for further information and can stop processing until the information is received. Further information may be needed to help the Council understand the impacts of a designation. An outline plan is a critical component of the designation process. An outline plan is a plan or description of work that a requiring authority proposes to carry out works on a designated site. The outline plan often contains more detailed information that is not available when the Notice of Requirement was prepared. This is intended to allow some flexibility with the future use of land while protecting the land for a specific purpose. An outline plan need not be submitted if the Council waives the requirement for an outline plan, the works were incorporated into the designation, the works have been otherwise approved under the RMA. An example of where a requiring authority might lodge an outline plan is where the Minister of Education has a designation for a school on a site, but at the time the designation was confirmed, there were no final building plans. Once the Minister of Education wishes to begin construction, he or she or their representative, for example the Ministry of Education, would lodge outline plans of the proposed buildings and associated car parking and landscaping and other ancillary plans with the Council for comment. The Public Works Act of 1981, the PWA, sets out the process and requirements for the acquisition of land, including compulsory acquisition by a requiring authority and the provisions of compensation. Where the requiring authority is a network utility operator, these provisions provide for compulsory acquisition by the Crown, Minister of Land Information, on behalf of the requiring authority. It is important to note that requiring authorities generally prefer to negotiate property acquisition rather than use their compulsory acquisition powers. Let's walk through the complete designation process. As I mentioned before, it all starts with the district plan. From there, the requiring authority carries out the site selection process. A notice of requirement is then lodged with the appropriate city or district councils. Once the notice of requirement is lodged, the council can request additional information if it's needed, and public notification is made, again, if required. This occurs for a period of 20 days. Public submission is made and public hearings take place for 10 business days. Once the public weighs in, the council will make its recommendation to the requiring authority. The requiring authority then has 30 working days to make a decision on the council's recommendation. Notice is then sent out to stakeholder parties. Parties have an opportunity to appeal the decision, and depending on the outcome of the decision, then it comes into effect.